Good morning, everybody. My name is Judith Rosenbaum from the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm honored to be with you here today and to be moderating this session on collections as evidence, collections for engagement. I'm going to start with a little bit of historical context for our conversation. In June 1892, in the midst of a massive wave of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe and subsequent rising anti-Semitism, a group of 40 men and one woman gathered to found the first ethnic archive in the US. Cyrus Adler, the first American PhD in Semitics, who by then already worked at the US National Museum, now the Smithsonian, both called the meeting and called it to order. The new organization defined its goal this way. The object of this society is to collect and publish material bearing on the history of our country. It goes on to delineate Jewish contributions to the US from the discovery of America to the settlement of the colonies, from the Revolutionary War to 19th century government, concluding with the definitive assertion that the objects for which this society was organized are not sectarian, but American. From this origin story, we can identify two persistent themes in American Jewish collecting: agency in defining who Jews are and the roles that they have played, and the contention that this alternative narrative is not only Jewish, but also essential to understanding America. And I would say that actually our gathering today reflects these continued themes and commitments as well. The founders of the HHS did not specifically mention anti-Semitism that day in 1892. The term actually had not really come into vogue yet. But they explicitly referenced the work that the society would accomplish in combating negative perceptions and self-perceptions of Jews. Reverend Dr. Kohler of New York argued that the society, quote, if successful, can only arouse self-respect in the Jew himself and raise him in the eyes of his fellow citizens. Dr. Charles Gross of Harvard declared, if we can show clearly to the people of the United States what the Jews of this country have done, what they have contributed as citizens of the Republic, we shall accomplish a great work. We shall add not merely to the history of the United States, we shall add greatly to the welfare of the Jews in America. While the American Jewish Historical Society collected historical documents to testify to the value and belonging of Jewish citizenry, the first American Jewish museums also aimed to demonstrate the significance of Jewish cultural history, in part as defense against negative perceptions of Jews. Cyrus Adler founded and curated the Judaica collection at the Smithsonian, and also as chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, oversaw the 1931 opening of the Museum of Jewish Ceremonial Objects, the precursor to the Jewish Museum. The exhibiting of ritual objects was designed to counteract anti-Semitism and promote Jewish pride. These collections raised awareness of Judaism and its place within world religions, and proved that, like other nations, Jews created beautiful art, which was an indication of its value as a civilization. Collecting and interpreting Jewish ceremonial objects claimed legitimacy for Jewish culture, and rather than presenting Judaism as different and exotic, these objects were exhibited as central to a Judeo-Christian tradition, emphasizing Jewish similarity as a bulwark against anti-Semitism. At the same time, by showing Jewish objects from an American context, these collections suggested the existence of American Jewish identity, thus implicitly challenging the assumption of the US as a Christian nation. These various goals capture the tensions and conflicts within Jewish collections, some of which we've heard a little bit about already, the simultaneous desire for acceptance and pride, for sameness and distinctiveness. And they also reflect the cultural impulses of the time, a kind of melting pot cultural pluralism that both acknowledges difference and asserts its mutability. By the late 1930s, as anti-Semitism in Europe became more dire, Jewish collections were imbued with new purpose: to build empathy and encourage civic engagement. As Paul Romanoff, the curator of the Museum of Jewish Ceremonial Objects, wrote in 1939, our museum has become a medium for interracial tolerance and understanding. So I think this suggests that we can also trace the Identity Museum and its role as a democratic institution back before the Civil Rights Movement, where it's often assumed to have begun, to the 1930s. The post-war period brought new directions and an expansion of Jewish collecting. In New York in 1947, the Museum of Jewish Ceremonial Objects reopened as the Jewish Museum in its new location in the Warburg Mansion. and soon shifted to collecting and exhibiting contemporary art. In the same year, historian Jacob Rader Marcus founded the American Jewish Archives at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati to safeguard Jewish history in the aftermath of the Holocaust. From the destruction and dispersion of European Jewry came not only the salvaging and reallocation of Jewish cultural property, but also the assertion of American Jewry's new position of communal and cultural leadership. Collecting became a response to diaspora. In the second half of the 20th century, this led to the creation of museums and collections to document Jewish communities across the US, from Baltimore to Oakland, Jackson to Chicago, Philadelphia to Milwaukee to Portland, Oregon. Some of these institutions, in addition to showcasing local history, also memorialize the decimated communities of Eastern European Jewry, thus rooting anti-Semitism in their collections in new ways that explored bias and resilience and opened up the possibility of partnership and allyship and connecting to larger conversations about bigotry and racism. In recent years, many Jewish collections have focused increasingly on strengthening Jewish identity and continuity, along with the ongoing work of illustrating the merit of Jews as Americans and as allies to other communities, and citing the place of the Jewish story in American history. Some have come to see museums as a kind of secular shul, a place to create Jewish meaning and connection, as well as to link Jewish experience to larger questions of civic engagement. This has required and invited a democratization of collections, both in terms of the voices that are included and the means by which collections are gathered. And I can speak here a little bit from my own experience at the Jewish Women's Archive. We were founded as a digital collection, a digital archive in 1996 to expand the narrative of both Jewish history and women's history by documenting and amplifying the voices of Jewish women and making them radically accessible to anyone, anywhere. Our work challenges the master narratives that assume that Jews and Jewish experience to be male and women to be Gentile. By reordering margin and center, we reconsider not only who is included, but also, for example, the periodization of Jewish history, central Jewish life cycle moments, motivations for activism, and models of leadership. Over the years, we've extended that challenge to focus on documenting underrepresented Jewish women, such as Mizrahi and Sephardi women, LGBTQ Jews, Jewish women of color, Jewish women in the Global South, and Jews with disabilities, as well as exploring changing conceptions and experiences of gender. As a digital archive, we've also collected and provided access to new materials, such as oral histories of both prominent and quote-unquote ordinary Jewish women, documenting the ways that gender, class, place, race, religion, and ethnic identity shape their lives. The work to diversify the narrative, while not undertaken primarily to combat anti-Semitism, serves that goal by challenging stereotypes and assumptions about who Jews are and what they have experienced. It provides also new insights into anti-Semitism when considered through the lens of gender, noting, for example, the intersection and mutual constituting of misogyny and anti-Semitism. Until recently, collections and exhibitions have primarily addressed anti-Semitism as part of the past. Our current moment, of course, calls us to reconsider that focus. It may also prompt us to contemplate when anti-Semitism should be framed in a larger, more general context of prejudice and genocide, and when rooted more specifically in the context of Jewish history. There are important lessons about bigotry and human rights to glean from a wider context, to be sure, but what specificity and insights need to be held onto. Another challenge in focusing on anti-Semitism in our collections and exhibitions is finding the balance, as we've heard already, between hate and joy, between destruction and resilience, or as Barbara Kirchenbach-Gimblett has said, will the world know more about how Jews died than how they lived? Even the change in the title of this panel, I think, reflects that tension. We went from collecting past and present hate to build a better future to collections as evidence, collections for engagement, for the very understandable reason that we want to leave room to discuss connection, allyship, resilience, and joy, and not focus exclusively on hate. Finally, how do we build our collections to document history as it unfolds? A question that even those founders of the American Jewish Historical Society were asking back in 1892, though of course we have radically different tools at our disposal today. Over the past few years, the Jewish Women's Archive has invited the public to be our partners in collecting, as have many other institutions represented here, including CAJM itself, the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, the Tenement Museum, Jewish Museum of Maryland, and many more. In the case of JWA, we've collected specifically around the Me Too movement, the pandemic, and most recently October 7th and its aftermath, among other topics. How explicitly should we center documenting and combating anti-Semitism in these efforts? How do we do so in a way that honors the diversity of Jewish experience and welcomes partners and allies? And what does this look like when even the definitions of what counts as anti-Semitism are so fraught? How do we use collections to both document and it contain the confusion and pain that Josh named in our last presentation and also hold nuance? And how can primary evidence illuminate the past and present and set us on a path to a better future, as our original title called us to do? I look forward to learning from our illustrious panelists and our conversation today. We are very privileged to have with us Jenna Leventhal of the USC Shoah Foundation, Lisa Sasaki of the Smithsonian Institution, and Sarah Clunis of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture at the Wadsworth Atheneu. And we will begin with Jenna Leventhal.
Thank you, Judith. Good morning. As stewards of the voices of 52,000 Holocaust survivors, the work of the USC Shoah Foundation exemplifies this notion of collections as evidence and collections of engagement. Using our visual history archive, where's our slide people back there? Okay. Using our visual history archive, USC Shoah Foundation's interactive programming, research, and materials are accessed in museums and universities, cited by government leaders and NGOs, and taught in classrooms around the world. If you don't mind doing that, will this do my slides? It will. Ooh, all the power. Our strengths are based on our collections, are based on the voices of the individuals who entrusted their stories with us, and we're guided by this core purpose to be able to give opportunity for the survivors and witnesses to the Shoah to tell their stories in their own words and preserve these testimonies and make them accessible for research, education, and outreach for the betterment of humankind in perpetuity. It is a mouthful, but it is something that is infused throughout all of our work. Growing our collection. In addition to the promises we made to survivors to keep their stories, we want to continue to build from this, and we think that this can be a potential helpful context to think about how do we respond to what we're seeing today. Beginning with our collections, it's the source from which everything else emerges for us at the Shoah Foundation. And our unique value proposition is the acquisition, storage, and access and dissemination of testimonies. And it's with that lens that we're looking to new and sizable collections to document the experiences and survivors and victims of today's anti-Semitic attacks, including here in the United States. And when I say today, I mean from the post-1945 world up into the present as it continues to evolve. Planning for a collection of nearly 10,000 or more than 10,000 testimonies from survivors of various attacks and incidents began in earnest really last year this time. We have had a collection called our Countering Anti-Semitism Through Testimony collection that for the last couple of years has sat fairly static with about 67, 68 testimonies, several from survivors of the Pittsburgh shooting and a number of other instances around the globe. As we're looking to expand the collection, we're thinking about this through 5 parts. By expanding our work, taking testimonies from survivors of anti-Semitic terror attacks, in this category, looking at everything from the AMIA bombings in Buenos Aires to what we saw on October 7th. We've now amassed a collection of 400 survivor testimonies that we took in Israel in the days, weeks, and now months after October 7th, but we're also going to be expanding our collections and take testimony with experiences of anti-Semitism in the Middle East and North Africa, anti-Semitism under communist rule, Ethiopian Jewish experiences of anti-Semitism, and the American experience of anti-Semitism beginning with the Civil Rights era, being able to shine light and let individuals speak to this notion of ways in which we can understand the varying changes of what we think of for the American Jewish experience. Our October 7th collection right now is being processed and made available online through our website, not in the archive just yet, but we wanted to get those out for those who wanted to listen and to watch. We have survivors of the kibbutzim, first responders, survivors of the Nova concert, Jews, non-Jews, freed hostages, Holocaust survivors who are also October 7th survivors. We looked at the work in trying to have geographical representation, diversity in backgrounds, age range, and think about offering opportunities for the individuals who really wish to share their stories and their experience. We have an obligation to tackle the world's oldest hatred, and we have the greatest advantage possible from our perspective. We provide a megaphone for which survivors can speak long after they are no longer able to do so in person. Our anti-Semitism initiatives will allow audiences, both Jewish and non-Jewish, because I think a lot of what we're talking about here today is how can we do more than preach to the choir, to learn from people who experienced these events themselves. By using testimonies, we will also give survivors the all too rare opportunity to describe and define the bias they experienced. We'll collect experiences from around the world and ensure that our testimonies reflect the reality as it has continued to evolve since 1945. And unlike many initiatives, which consist of a top-down approach whereby someone points to a problem and says, here's some ways to fix it, we want to ensure that the voices of the survivors themselves resonate and remain relevant and provide a platform for them to inform the fight against anti-Semitism. Some of the work that we'll be doing with the testimonies, and I think there's a lot of opportunities to think about how do we as an organization based on an archive, based around an archive, can work with museums and historical societies and other organizations, think about how we can infuse testimony into training opportunities. So from our most recent Student Leadership Summit, where we trained a cohort of 20 USC student athletes, primarily the track and field team, which apparently has won more Olympic medals than some small nations just within them. So they're apparently a really big deal, I've been told. As you can tell, I'm not clearly well-versed enough in these matters, but what I can say is being able to take a group of student athletes that have a voice on campus and have a leadership role within their local communities, and then once they graduate and become those seasoned alumni of a place like USC, be able to find ways for them to use their own voice in identifying anti-Semitism and then countering it. Also doing work with civil servants, Department of State, and other opportunities. Obviously also working through outreach. There's going to be a number of scholarly opportunities to dig into the new set of testimonies that we'll be bringing into the archive. And then also think about policy engagements. How can the survivors of anti-Semitic events help inform the policy decisions, and being able to provide access to that through venues like the IHRA and other avenues is a very important focus for us, both here and abroad. And then lastly, looking through the lens of countering anti-Semitism online through perhaps counter-narratives, when we look at testimony as a counter-narrative to the type of hate that is being spread and shared through various channels online. We're going to be doing some work to be able to identify how that hate moves online, and then be able to provide some counter-narratives to that work. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse of how Shoah Foundation is looking at the work of countering anti-Semitism from this moment forward. There's a lot of resources on our website, but I'll be around and you can put the post-it notes on there, and happy to discuss and see, as Josh mentioned, the opportunities for collaboration with museums and universities is where we, I think, all need to be, which is why we're here. So thank you, Melissa, for bringing us all together.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Lisa Sasaki, and I'm currently the Deputy Undersecretary for Special Projects at the Smithsonian Institution. But I stand up here in front of you in this podium, not necessarily wearing that hat, although that is one of the hats that I do occupy. I'm the former director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, as well as the former interim director of the brand new Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. But why I'm here, I feel, really has to do with the 28 plus years of community-based and identity-based museum experience that I bring to this moment. And I just want to acknowledge that in that journey, many of you, as I look out across the tables, have been there to support me. The Jewish American Museum community really stood as a group of professionals who, at a time when I was working at the Japanese American National Museum, there really wasn't a huge ton of Asian American and Pacific Islander museums that we were able to really connect with and to share experiences with. We all knew one another, but when we worked together, it became very clear that we were being very myopic. We were having the same discussions. And being invited into CAJM, being invited into the conferences, really opened my eyes to see the larger connections that we all have as communities within the United States. It gave opportunities to really have really deep discussions about really important topics. It makes me sad, to be honest, that I stand up here today to talk about something that we also sadly have in common, which is racism and hate. It's something that I feel we all were hoping in our deepest part of our hearts as professionals that our work would enable us no longer to have these conversations. But we're here yet again. And what I wanted to do as somebody who is not Jewish is to come up and perhaps provide another perspective from another community that has experienced these issues. As we've heard from our speakers prior, this is cyclical in nature. It also impacts communities. And when we see hate and racism in one area, we also start to see it in others. And sometimes in viewing that, we can better understand and better see our ways through this together. The other thing that I bring in front of you today is something that a lot of people don't realize, which is I started my career out in collections. I thought I was going to be a collections manager. So for me, I do understand that museums, one of our core resources, one of the things that makes us who we are, isn't only the public trust that we hold, but it's also the collections that we hold. And I will admit that during part of my 8 minutes that I have with you, I am going to nerd out a little bit, because I do think that as we talk about collections, we also need to think about how we care for those collections. But in these moments like this, how do we do collections care in addition to collections and care? So, as Judith has explained, like Jewish American museums, Asian American and Pacific Islander museums and other community-based museums started off in a very similar place of collecting. We were collecting the histories that were often not being represented within mainstream museums. It became a community responsibility to go in and do the difficult task of collecting images, artifacts, stories that had largely been ignored. They were not in textbooks, they were not being recorded, the hard images were not being shown in textbooks and in exhibitions. They were being glossed over. And what we did was we really focused on caring for those collections as the caretakers for these images, those stories, those artifacts. But there was a distance, I think we can all say, between sort of the analytical approach to what things were like in the past and what we were stewarding and the current day. But we knew that collections had power. We knew that by showing a pile of suitcases and talking about a time when a family only had 24 to 48 hours to figure out how they could move their lives into only what they could carry and going into an unknown future based on wartime hysteria and prejudice and fear, we knew we were able to use those objects to do things like teach empathy, to dismantle stereotypes, to really talk about difficult subjects, but really build a bridge between those stories, those experiences, and the present, the viewers who were born after these times, who are only hearing about this as something that occurred to somebody else. And then we have moments of crisis that appear in our world, whether that is a moment of terror, whether it is a pandemic, whether it is a crisis of some sort that triggers and brings up to the surface everything that was lying underneath, all those things that were previously talked about where we thought the prejudice, the bias was going away, that we were only talking about small instances of hate and fear. These crises would bring those out to the surface, and suddenly our communities are facing something that looks very different. An increase, a dramatic surge in the case of Asian Americans, where we saw a 400% increase, as high as 1 out of every 4 Asian Americans or Asians were facing threats of violence and discrimination on a day-to-day basis during the pandemic. And we also saw communities respond, like this march that occurred in Chinatown. It was one of the earliest marches that recognized and actually tried to step in and stem the tide, recognizing that this was just the start of what was going to become something that was much, much bigger. This particular banner is now part of the Smithsonian's collection. It's collected through the National Museum of American History and is now also on display to sort of talk about this moment. So what we see is within this time, a very short time period, going from collecting about the past to now collecting contemporary issues, some of which were happening in the moment. This is an image from Georgia with the shooting that occurred there, the massacre that occurred there, where so many women lost their lives, and the immediate response into what we could see in real life as it was happening in that moment, the misogyny, the xenophobia, the racism that was occurring not only in the act, but also in the response, the media's response to it, the community's response to it, some of the reactions that were occurring at the time. And so what we recognize is as we do this contemporary collecting, as we start to go in a moment, not just about collecting about the past, but collecting in the moment, we recognize we're doing that in a time that there's a polarized landscape. As our speakers have already talked about, it's hard to know what to say. It feels like everybody is mad at you in some way, and it just feels really difficult to take that stand, to make that statement, to find the right words that's able to fully encapsulate not just the heartbreak of a community, but also the huge complexities that are just underneath the surface of all of these objects, these images, these moments. So what do we do? What do we do as museums? And this is the moment where I nerd out a bit and mention that we are doing this contemporary collecting with collections policies and ways of doing things within museums that honestly are 40 years old, 50 years old. Some people are nodding. It's true, right? Our best practices when it has come to collecting collections were often done at a time where this was not top of mind, where we were not thinking necessarily about what it meant to collect in the present. So how do we do things differently? So what I wanted to share with you is a little bit about some recent work that I did with the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. We took a pause because very seldom do you have the opportunity to start from scratch, to question best practices and say, if we were starting a museum in this moment, right, and not using best practices that were ratified 30 or 40 years ago, what would be our best practices today? And here are some of the findings from a group of very, very smart collections managers, curators, and professionals across the Smithsonian, which is this. We recognize that within contemporary collecting, we are going to be needing to address trauma. That we have sensitive collections that before we had that distance. We recognized sometimes there were hard images in drawers or in archives, but now we need to recognize that these are people's lived experiences, especially those of our staff. So how do we help staff better prepare for that? Do we need trigger warnings in the databases on drawers so staff have a moment to be able to prepare themselves before looking at something? How do we better support our staff as they go through the very difficult task of not only caring for these objects, but then also thinking about how they present that to the public and how they engage with the public in these dialogues. And perhaps maybe the positions that we have currently are not adequate. Some of the recommendations that came out of that is maybe we need new positions. Maybe we need therapists on staff, art therapists, to work just not only with our visitors, but also with our staff as well as they deal with these things. How do we do consultation differently? How do we learn from across the museum field about different practices, better practices, maybe not best, because we're still trying to figure that out, but better practices of how to do consultation, how to be able to be present as we do that hard task of hearing about people's lived experiences, and then being in the difficult position of then needing to be able to share that with others. How do we center self-care for the professionals that are doing this work? I look at all of us who are here. We do this work because we care so deeply. We want to make a difference. We want to see a world in which this hate doesn't take place. And we have to recognize that we have a lot that we then absorb. And we just carry on and we continue to carry on a day-to-day basis. And we need to have those safe spaces, those rooms we can go to, those moments where we can acknowledge that we too are experiencing loss, sadness, anger, frustration, and all of those different emotions that we have. And then finally, I do think that we need some joy in the world as we do this. How do we counter some of the things that we are seeing and allow ourselves not to feel guilty in talking about that and having that celebration, and not just always having to justify when we celebrate ourselves, our communities, and our histories on that. So I just wanted to share some of these thoughts and put out for all of you as we go into this new world, as we recognize that this is a moment in the cycle where we are on the front lines. How then do we start to do things differently as museums? And I do think that it goes to the base understanding of what we do within our collections and how do we think about our collections and how we care for those collections differently. How can we insert care into collections, not just a care for collections, but a care for ourselves, for our visitors, and yes, for those collections that we steward into the future. Thank you.
Today, I have a love letter for y'all. To bind someone, you tie a knot, and to begin a basket too. There is a room in the Peabody Museum at Harvard University full of knotted things. As curator of the African collection at the Peabody, I found the baskets the most interesting. They're coiled and tangled things. One basket sits within a glass vitrine, encased. It is made by Alan Green from Sapelo Island in McIntosh County, Georgia. It was collected in 1980. I go to Sapelo to find him. He is not there. Well, he is there, buried in a cemetery called Behavior. The work we do can often be confusing, an exchange of things seen and unseen, a meeting at a crossroads, dangerous stuff. Instead of Mr. Green, I find Yvonne Grosvenor, master basket weaver, oral historian, and matriarch of Sapelo Island. She was a student of Alan Green's. In a 1975 article in the Darien Tribune, Green lamented that the skill of making baskets, inherited from West African ancestors, Kisi, Gola, Igbo, and Fulani, would eventually be lost. He taught Yvonne, and she has kept it alive. I came to Sapelo to learn more about the making of a sweetgrass basket. What I found there was a story of enslaved people and their descendants going as far back as the 18th century. From a population of over 500 people of African descent, only 27 still live on the island, struggling to preserve a rapidly declining descendant community. In addition to enslavement, the people of Sapelo have faced displacement from their homes, enormous tax hikes, a rapidly eroding coastline, environmental poisoning from a variety of chemical and industrial factors, and the looming specter of luxury hotels like those to be found on nearby Hilton Head and Amelia Islands. This sweetgrass basket holds fascinating historical things. Everything that makes a sweetgrass basket comes from the land. On Sapelo, it is the land that yields an art form to its makers. Wrapped, coiled, and woven into the basket is the story of the unbelievable resilience of the descendant communities of Sapelo, a story told by people who still speak of Africa like a long chain of griots singing into the sand, a story that begins on another continent and unfolds here, on this island in the Atlantic, and in this basket too. When I arrived at the Peabody, I was asked to write exhibit text for the basket. 100 words they asked me for. I went to find those words and found a world instead that opened mine. It led to a series of interviews of community elders still living on Sapelo. During one of those interviews, Stanley Walker sung a song I knew. I started to sing with him, an old Sapelo song, an old Jamaican song. Turns out Thomas Spalding had plantations on both Sapelo and Jamaica. Knotted things, crossroads. This beaded skirt is another tangled and knotted thing. It shines luminous and red with coral from the sea. It was made by the people of the Benin Kingdom for the court of the Oba, the king of Edo. Descended from a long line, 20 centuries to be exact, of lineage ancestors who also ruled this kingdom, it was also stolen, looted from the treasury of the palace in Benin City by the British when they invaded the city, burnt it to the ground, and exiled the Oba in February of 1897. Red coral beads are sacred to the Edo. Traditionally, they are all considered under the ownership of the Oba, returned each year during the Ugie Evie ceremony, where they are still ceremoniously washed with the blood of sacrificial animals. When I arrived at the Peabody, the beaded coral skirt was kept in collection storage, encased in white conservation-grade tissue, barely touched because of its delicate nature, controversial because of its difficult history, sacred, yet stolen, a hybrid thing. Coral traded by the Portuguese to the Benin Kingdom was just one of the many trade items exchanged for people. People forcibly transported away from their land to faraway places like Jamaica, to toil and suffer and long for home. I too have been described as a hybrid thing. Portuguese, Sephardic, and African Igbo ancestors meet in the same body. The Oba of Benin raided Igbo villages to the east and sold their people for bronze currency, traded for coral beads and fine fabrics with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and eventually the British. When I arrived at the Peabody, I asked that the Benin bronzes be taken out of storage. This skirt was with them. The bronzes became for me my entire purpose at the Peabody. Educate about these objects and their complicated and tangled nature. Encourage repatriation, at least begin the conversation. And so it was done. The conversation begun. I left the Peabody and the coral beads found their way back to storage, each shiny red bead laying like droplets, staining a cushion of white. When I arrived at the Peabody, I immediately went onto the database and typed the word Jewish. What Jewish things could they have here? I thought they have everything here. The whole world is here. Here it was. Jewish frontlet, found buried in Mr. Joseph Merrick's yard, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, May 1815. This tefillin became like a dream to me, another knotted thing to love. As African curator, they were really not in my purview, and yet, as a Jew, they were completely consuming and precious. They never really showed up for me, these tefillin, for almost 3 years that I was at the Peabody. But they showed up after October 7th of last year. For a month, I worked from home, then took all my vacation days, a total separation like a curtain drawn between me and my beloved museum, a campus I had come to call home. When I eventually returned in January, there was a request from a sexton and ritual specialist for one of the oldest Sephardic congregations in the US. He wanted to view the tefillin, but had been denied. The Peabody, scrambling to meet NAGPRA's new regulations, had a new policy that limited collections access to something like indigenous or ritual specialists seeking access to sacred ritual items only. Someone added me to this email chain, and I reached out, but it was a bigger reach than you could possibly imagine. It was a reach across time and space, and it ultimately closed the circle of time for me at Harvard. I gave this ritual specialist access to our sacred ritual item. I sat with him as he examined it in a cold, quiet, white room, and I gave the Peabody something to think about when I insisted that this request fell well within the policy. And then I suggested that because access had been denied, that this tefillin should be repatriated to a Jewish institution with ritual specialists that could care for it and grant access to researchers. Now, for an object to be repatriated when it is not federally regulated, the request has to go up the ladder of hierarchy at Harvard until it reaches the board of trustees. This tefillin showed up for me, and for all of us, really, at a time when it most needed to be seen. The request for repatriation will mean that it must pass through multiple offices at Harvard and confront many individuals with its ritual effective power and its insistence that it too belongs to a people that have sacred things once buried beneath the earth of this land. When I arrived at Harvard, at the Peabody, I knew less about myself than I do now. These are just some of the objects that translated histories, that transported and transformed the minds of the people I worked with, the students I taught, and ultimately me. They, the objects, transformed me. These objects, they transported me to places I had never been, outer worlds and inner worlds, not just of the past, but of the present, injustices, exiles, diasporas. They introduced me to people I needed to know and held space and time together with their complicated, knotted natures. These objects exist as witness, as evidence, as portals. One of them brought me here to be with you. They ultimately have the power to bind us together in an intimate, intricate, woven web, in a state of shared survival.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your beautiful presentations. Before we turn to questions from the audience, I have a couple of questions that I want to pose to all of you. So, Sarah, you just spoke so beautifully about the power of objects to hold space for us and to bring us in. And we've also been talking about the larger context. So we have both that inner piece, you know, the specific objects, and then the larger context that may turn our attention to them or help us read them in different ways. So what I want to ask is how, how have the crises of the last few years, of which there have been so many, from the murder of George Floyd to the pandemic to January 6th to October 7th, how have these been ruptures or wake-up calls in your experience of community, safety, identity, and history, and how has that shaped your approaches to the work and to objects themselves?
You want me to start? I think the big separation for me was I felt that because all of the crises that you've mentioned, all of the tragedies that you mentioned have impacted me in many ways, and many of us, I'm sure all of us in this room. But I want to say that I felt a larger community response of support for the pandemic and even for police violence against Black bodies. And when October 7th happened, my most visceral experience was logging on after the holiday of Simchat Torah, which ends really a whole series of holidays, Jewish holidays, high holy days, and looking on Facebook and seeing my colleagues respond to the violence that happened to Jews on October 7th almost with joy. And this is before, any kind of retaliation, any kind of defense. And I found myself completely isolated within my profession. And I don't think I will ever be the same. I think it made me choose to leave the place that I had worked my whole life to be at. It made me choose to look at things that have an elite status with suspicion. And it made me wonder, with all the things that I had incorporated so strongly into my being about diversity and inclusion, it made me wonder, what does this really mean and who is not included in this? And so I'm carrying that now into it's a defensiveness that I never had before, but it definitely informs the work that I do.
I think for me, it was how quick, as we went through all of those moments, how quick myself and particularly other communities became the other, became the target, for lack of a better word, the target for the fear that we had swirling around us. because I think these crises have sort of wiped away our safety, and realizing that how quickly people turn to try to blame somebody else, and how quickly the divides started to appear. I think for all of us within our communities, as communities of color, we recognize that we go through moments where we see ourselves as Americans, and it takes these moments to kind of strip that away, and it's amazing how that safety kind of disappears. And so for me, what I think kind of struck me is the quickness, how quickly we went to the other, how quickly we went to blame, and as a result, how that affected me and the loss of safety and security in the structures that I had always felt such comfort in, whether that was democracy, whether that was voting, the peaceful transition of power, all of these things that just felt so inalienable, all of a sudden became something that didn't seem very reliable anymore. And I recognize that that is something that many of us are experiencing through the last several years. And then also, to the points that some of our earlier speakers made, also the realization that those issues have always been there, and it just takes these moments to put a spotlight on it.
I think one of the interesting things, especially being on a college campus and all of the issues that we see about being played out with young people and who are at a moment in their lives where they are trying to define themselves, what matters to them, what issues they wish to stand for. And I think the idea of being able to sit and have a constructive conversation, as we've seen all of these moments of crises, it has given all of us as professionals, unfortunately, fortunately, an opportunity to figure out how do we support constructive conversations, how do we listen to one another, how do we hear that othering, how that's manifesting, how it's impacting others. And then from that point, we can start to have perhaps more repair from those moments of crisis.
Right. I mean, I think, obviously all of us believe that our work matters. That's why we do it. But I think that the last several years have really made clear how high the stakes are. And that can be very frightening in a certain sense, and especially when our when our own identities are very much invested in the work and sometimes under scrutiny. But I think it also suggests an opportunity, right? Like it gives us a chance to see the ways that collections can actually make a difference. And I think particularly I want to underline in a time when evidence is very suspect. And we, hopefully have still a shred of remaining credibility in terms of the materials that we can put forward that that maybe can help intervene in those conversations. So the second question I want to ask is about, sort of what if we can dream and imagine the opportunity that we have for the ways that collections could make a meaningful difference in this moment, and what it would take to bring those visions to reality.
I'll start again. I think the job of curators is changing. Let's just say it's transforming. When I became a curator, I would say 25, 30, almost 30 years ago, it was a different conversation. And I even see job descriptions for curators now, and I'm like, okay, but we're changing, we're different. I see the work that I do now and the work that I will do going forward as community engagement is incredibly essential to what I do. And that's as a curator, not as a collection manager, right? I think they're two different things. And the objects that I presented today are objects that I have knowledge about because I have actively gone into communities to learn about those objects from people who make them, from descendants of people who sort of took their history and transformed it through diaspora, through exile, through hardship, through survival. And through that communication, these objects bring me into community with people. And people tell their stories. And I see myself less as an author and more as a mediator or a facilitator of cultural knowledge. So moving forward, my ideal space, museum space, is one that incorporates community fully and completely.
I think we have an opportunity to talk about the contemporary. And I know that that's really challenging. Josh mentioned this, in his talk about how challenging it is for museums to talk about contemporary issues, but that's where collections are so wonderful, right? The chair and the cup, a banner, those allow us to tell a story that allows people to see that they are in a moment of history themselves. History isn't something that happened to somebody else. We are actually in that moment right now. And to that earlier question that Eric had posed about what would you do, right, in that moment? That's what we have that ability to do with these contemporary objects, is to say, you're in that moment right now. What would you do if you were in that situation? How would you do things differently? Because I think that's where we see the true change occurring, not in getting people to learn the lessons of the past. It's realizing that those lessons are active today, and it's up to us to determine a different outcome if we don't want to see the same things happen.
Right, and inviting, one of the beauty of objects is the ways that they invite the person who's looking at them to be in their own interpretive relationship with them. So as you're both saying, inviting them into that conversation and to see themselves as part of that process of making meaning.
And I think about, a testimony as an object. I've been listening to you guys, trying to see how there are these similarities, and thinking about how a visitor, a user, a viewer is going to bring their context, they're going to be looking through whatever it is, through their lens, and acknowledging that and being able to foster a culture where we can listen and see an object, see an individual story, and begin to understand that the way that I'm seeing it is through my own lived experience.
Melissa, do we have any questions, or should we wrap up? No new questions. Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for sharing a bit about your own collections and also your own context and the ways in which you connect. And I think that one of the themes that has emerged already in this conference, and that certainly has emerged in my conversations with many of you over the last several months, is about that sense of isolation and alienation that many of us have felt from communities, from our professions perhaps. But I think that collections invite us in to think about where we can find ourselves in the story, and therefore find community and speak across some of that sense of isolation. So thank you for inviting us into that conversation and opening that up for us today.
Hi, I just want to take 2 minutes to share with you some of the conversation we've had over the past months as we've been planning for the summit, and to acknowledge something that I've called not merely the elephant in the room, but the herd of elephants in this room. And that is the conversations that we're hearing, the news stories, the demonstrations about anti-Zionism, about anti-Israel, about Israel in general, and its relationship to anti-Semitism, to hatred of Jews. There's a debate. Jews love to debate, and just like, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel in the first century, in the rabbinic conversation, there are multiple definitions of what exactly is anti-Semitism. And in this intellectual pursuit, we even argue how to write it and spell it. Like there might be some opportunity to take the fangs out of this terror by insisting it has to be lowercase or whether or not it has a hyphen. But we all know, and we must all recognize, that discussions about Zionism, discussions that are blatantly anti-Zionist, many discussions, many critiques, not all, about Israel, about the state of Israel, about the existence of Israel, are inflected with, are infected by hatred of Jews. And we're feeling it daily, hourly, personally, collectively, nationally, internationally, and more so after October 7th. We were planning this program, and then we started again, because the story has changed. And there have been mention of this, and it turned up in Josh's slides. October 7th has been discussed, but we'd be remiss as a group not to acknowledge this openly and publicly. The one silver lining we recognize as a group in our constant sharing of this barrage of emails we shared amongst ourselves as we were planning were the virulent demonstrations, a small amount of them, that happened in museums, that showed within culturally specific and within Jewish museums and within large museum organizations and institutions, which were blatantly anti-Zionist and certainly inflected with and infected by anti-Semitism. But they showed that museums are a public square. Museums are recognized, are an important place for this discourse and conversation, and it doesn't have to be like that. We, modeling what we're doing here, can create cultures of civil discourse, can create a better future, and museums are essential to that conversation, but we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that topic and that herd of elephants that's sitting here with us.
I must say I'm spectacularly impressed that we're pretty much on time right now, but I'm going to immediately put us not on time. And the reason to do so is many of you have been sitting for a long period of time. I know out of a need for politeness, sometimes as many times as we say, please get up and walk, people don't. But what we would love to do is take 5 minutes. Please get up, move around, do what you need to do for the next 5 minutes, but then please do attempt to be back at 12:20 at your tables for the vitally important conversations that we need to have amongst ourselves and with all of your expertise.